We'll continue with the central nervous system. We're going to look at the spinal cord now. Now, the first few slides are the embryonic development of the spinal cord, and just like when we talked about the brain, we're going to skip over this stuff. It's very interesting for those that want to go through it, but it's not fair game for the test. So really, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it's found running the whole length of the spine. Now, people think that it goes right down to the sacrum. It really doesn't. It starts at the foramen magnum, at the skull, and then it extends down to about the level of the first lumbar vertebrae, where it ends as the conus medullaris. Most often it's just called the conus. Beyond that point, there are nerves that are basically part of the coming off the spinal cord, but that's called the cauda equina. So when people have disc herniations or central stenosis in their low lumbars, like L4, L5, it's not actually pushing on the spinal cord, but it's actually pushing on the cauda equina, which means the horse's tail, because that's what it looks like. So what does the spinal cord do to us? It actually provides communication between the periphery and the brain. It's also where we have the spinal reflexes. The protection of the spinal cord is the same as in the brain, in that there's bone that surrounds it, and then a meninges with the same idea of dura mater, arachnoid and pia mater, and with the epidural and space being filled with fat. There's in the subdural space there is blood vessels, and there is cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space. There are various ligaments that hold it in place, but the most important one is the one that goes from the conus all the way down to the bottom of the coccyx, and this is called the filum terminale, which means the end's tail. Excuse me. So it ends up looking like this. The vertebrae, so this is the sacral section, it's coming down, all of this, the cauda equina, and the filum terminale in green here, holding it in place. So all the spinal nerves come off of it at each level, but you'll see that the cell bodies of these lumbar and sacral ones are all up in here. They're all up in this lumbar enlargement, because what's extending down past here is the cauda equina are just nerves. They are bundles of axons. They, as we talked about in the peripheral nervous system, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come off, and most of the levels just have a pair of nerves coming off at each level. However, there's a lot of large nerves come off the cervical for the brachial plexus, and off the lumbar region for the lumbar and sacral plexus. So there's an enlargement. There's more cell bodies there. When you look at it in cross-section, there is a groove down the front and a groove down the back. They're called the median fissure on the back, or sorry, on the front, the ventral median fissure and the dorsal median sulcus. The center of it is gray matter, and it's hollow. There's a canal up the middle of it. So the gray matter looks like a little butterfly here, with a very small hole filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and that hole is continuous with the ventricles and the cerebral aqueduct in the brain, lined with the same sort of thing. A fundamental difference, though, is the white matter is on the outside, the gray matter is on the inside. Again, just a different look at it, with the meninges in place. So the gray matter is unmyelinated, and this is where the interneurons are found. This is also where the cell bodies for other neurons are found. So the dorsal horns at the back actually receive input from the sensory input from both visceral and somatic sensory neurons, and they synapse in the dorsal horn of the gray matter. The ventral horns actually have the cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons that go out by the ventral roots, and the lateral horns actually have the sympathetic neurons. On the dorsal root, there is a ganglion, and that's where the cell bodies for the sensory neurons are. So when we look at it like this, they're here. The cell bodies are here because these are unipolar. Interneurons here in the dorsal horn, motor neurons in the ventral horn, and autonomic neurons in the lateral horn. Okay. Now the white matter is myelinated, so it's all about transmitting impulses a long way. Really, the long way is to and from the brain. So the ascending tracts are all sensory, and they go up to the brain. The descending tracts are motor, and they're coming down from the brain. There's some commercial tracts that cross from one side to the other, but really there are these columns of tracts, and they tend to be going to the same area, and so they have similar functions, so they get named for that. So I'm not so worried about the pathways here, and I just want you to have a general understanding of the architecture here. But basically, if you look at it, the ones here in blue are sensory ascending tracts, which makes sense if we think of the dorsal horn here and the dorsal root as containing this sensory information. So the sensory neurons come from the periphery here, they synapse right in here, and then those interneurons synapse with ascending tracts that go up here and ascending tracts that go up here. And the ascending tracts tend to have spinal at the beginning. So this one goes from the spine to the cerebellum, so it's the spinocerebellar. This one's a ventral spinocerebellar. These columns end up going up to the cunate nucleus and the bacillus nucleus. We don't worry so much about it. These blue ones here go up to the thalamus, so the spinal thalamus, as does this one. This one goes to these red ones all go down, so they're coming from the brain. So this one is coming from the reticular formation, so it's the lateral reticulospinal. This one's coming from the cortex, the cerebral cortex, so that's the corticospinal. Cerebrospinal is from the red nucleus. Vestibulospinal is basically about balance, etc. Okay, one of the things that you'll notice is the ascending tracts seem to be at the back and lateral, very few at the front, where the descending tracts tend to be lateral and at the front, which makes sense because the motor neurons are all here in the anterior and lateral horn. So it just makes the most sense. This is why if somebody gets a contusion from the back and loses feeling, but still has motor, we know that the spine is still intact. So the ascending pathways really have 3 neurons. The first order neurons are the ones that are in the periphery. So these are the sensory neurons. And they're going to synapse with the second order neurons. And the second order neurons are considered interneurons. They're in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord for the most part, and they go all the way up to the thalamus or the cerebellum, whether the Spinocerebellar Pathways or Spinal Pathways. Okay. Then in the thalamus, there's another neuron that goes from the thalamus to the cortex of the cerebellum in those primary somatosensory areas, so the post-central gyrus. I'm not worried about the pathways so much. The spinocerebellar goes to the cerebellum, so it's part of feedback, as we discussed when we discussed what the cerebellum does. Again, more pathways that we're not that concerned about, but you can see that in more intricate study that discriminative touch and vibration are carried along different pathways and things. So really, by careful testing, you can figure out which part of the spinal column is damaged by the deficits involved. So again, it kind of looks like this. So first order neuron comes to here, synapses to the interneuron, which goes all the way up to the brain, and then the third order neurons kind of go from there. It's a continuation of the same. So there's second order ones, and then the third order ones are here. I'm not asking you to memorize pathways or where they cross over or anything like that, pain receptors and such, but nevertheless, they all end up crossing over at some point. The cerebellum, which is involved with balance and with fine-tuning motor control, obviously will convey information about muscle and tendon stretch, position. And again, the pathways are laid out here. The descending pathways either come directly or indirectly, but they're the efferent impulses, they're the motor impulses from the brain. There's 2 neurons, and this is important. There are upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. So really the upper motor neurons start in the motor cortex and they descend down. The lower motor neurons are in the ventral horn of the spine at the correct level, and they leave and innervate the spine. Symptomatology is the same. If a muscle is flaccid, not being able to be used, or paralyzed, it could be an upper motor neuron lesion or a lower motor neuron lesion. If it is a lower motor neuron lesion, then the reflex is usually absent. If it's an upper motor neuron lesion, the reflex is usually exaggerated because the spine is intact and the lower motor neuron is intact, but there's nothing modulating it. So hyperreflexive people are seen when they have an upper motor neuron lesion. Again, I'm not worried about the specifics, the pyramidal systems and etc. But for those that are interested, you can look at it. So the whole thing about the extrapyramidal or the indirect is that they are really for complex movements that require a lot of coordination. So things like controlling movement, maintaining posture, following objects, things like that. Various tracks, I'm not worried about them. Spinal cord trauma is all considered part of pathology. And so is polio and Lou Gehrig's disease, and the rest is developmental aspects. So that's all we're covering in the spinal cord.